Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Let's continue implementing core module of our application. Going to focus on implementing the mock API service as well as the crypto service. I'm going to define here a new class that's going to represent the mock URL protocol. In other words, we're going to provide the mock version of the URL session that conforms to the protocol URL protocol. I would like to override the option that determines whether this protocol can handle a given request, can init true. In other words, it will intercept all requests. I'm going to override another option, which is to return a canonical version of the request. We're going just to return the same request as the parameter. Now we'll start handling the intercepted request. For the stop loading, we're not interested in this. I'm gonna leave it empty. On start loading, first of all, we try to handle the request and get the response data. Then we're going to tell the client URL session that we have received a response, then send back the data and indicate that the loading is finished. And if there is any error, we're going to send back an error within the do catch. As I said before, if there is any error, we're going to use the client, and it is nullable by doing URL protocol, and we have to pass the error as an argument. As I said before, we have to make the request or to handle the request. Therefore, I'm going to create here a private function. I'm going to call it handler, and it has in parameter a request of type URL request. If you see this kind of symbol, it means that it's not mandatory to put the named parameter. The role of this function, handler, it is the function that's going to decide what response should be returned based on the request. It's basically the same principle that we have done under the mock API service in Kotlin. As the return type, our URL response with its related data. For the implementation of this handler, we're going to do it later on, but we have to finish what we're going to do here under start loading. So first of all, what we have to do is we have to call the function handler. Let our new value, response and data. Now we have the response and the data. Next, we're going to tell the client, which is the URL session, that we have received a response by doing client and URL protocol. For the first argument, it is self, which is this class, mock URL protocol. We received, of course, a response and cache storage policy, no caching. Next, we have to send back the data by doing client, URL protocol, and we have to pass here the self referring to the mock URL protocol. And did load, we have to pass here the data that we have obtained from calling handler. And we have to indicate that the loading is finished by doing client and URL protocol did finish loading. And we have to pass here self referring to the same class, which is mock URL protocol. And that's pretty much it for the start loading. For the stop loading, it's not mandatory, to be honest. Now let's focus on how to handle the requests and what are the data that should be returned from this function, as well as the response, according to the URL. Speaking of which, I'm going to get the URL from the request, nullable, therefore I have to use here a guard statement by doing guard and let URL equal request.url. If it is null, I like this syntax a lot, to be honest. If it's null, I'm going to do here throw URL error. Now we have to pass the error, for example, or the exception, bad URL. Now we have to encode the response data. First of all, I'm going to create here an encoder of type JSON encoder. Let's initialize the headers for the first key, which is the content type application JSON. Now we're going to check on routes. If you do remember, under the Kotlin version, we have done the when statement over routes. If we have, for example, the products route, we're going to return a response related to the list of products. And if it has the login, we're going to do response or to mock the response for login and so on. Therefore, I'm going to do here switch and true. And if it doesn't match any route, what we should do here, we're going to throw an error, NS error. I'm going to pass here the domain, which is basically URL and path. We have to say, for example, this path is not supported. And for the code here, it's going to be 400. Now let's define the available routes. So for the first case, which is URL, and if the URL contains this particular path, and the HTTP method, it has to be get in this case, a request handler for the products. Now we're going to do pretty much the same thing that we have done under the Kotlin version. And let's define the first request handler. I don't want to put all the stuff here inside basically this mock URL protocol class. Therefore, I'm going to use the extensions in order to make our code organized and neat. I'm going to do here extension over mock protocol. I'm going to add here a simple function. Let's call it get products, and it will give us basically the URL response as well as the related data. Now for the implementation, what we need here is the URL. We need the headers and the encoder, JSON encoder. Now let's initialize the response that should be returned. And we have to pass here the URL. For the status code, we are just getting the list of products, so it should be 200. And the HTTP version null. And for the headers, are the headers from calling the get products or the parameter. For the response data, we need to define the mock data that we have done previously under the Kotlin version. I'm going to provide here the mock data that I have prepared for this tutorial. Now, this is basically the mock data, and Xcode is complaining about thread-safe error-proof under the Xcode or under the Swift ecosystem to make this user DTO to conform to the protocol sendable. It's going to require a little bit of refactor under the API service. The type T should be sendable. Let's just check the mappers if we do have to update some stuff. Now let's come back to the products mock request. We will encode basically products pagination response. We will return the response as well as the response data. As simple as this. I'm going to add this operator to have the non-null value. We know for sure it's going to be created. There is no need actually to do here a guard statement. And here we're going to return products. And we have to provide the URL, the headers, and the encoder. We're going to do the same principle for the rest of the functions. And of course, here it has to be try because it's going to perhaps raise an exception. Now let's define the rest of the methods related to products. We must implement a function, getProductDetail. First, we need the response, and we need the response data. And I'm going to store here the correct response from the mock data just for readability purposes, which is sunglasses. Now we're going to check if the product's ID that we're going to pass on the path of the URL is equal to the correct ID of sunglasses product response. Therefore, I'm going to store the value path. First of all, we have to get the path from URL and path, and we have to split, and we have to take the last value, which is basically what we want. I'm going to store here the product ID or the conversion from string to integer 64. Afterward, we're going to compare. If we have the product equal to, or the product ID equal the correct version or the correct response, data and ID, therefore we're going to proceed. Otherwise, we're going to handle another response. All right. So for this particular section, what we have to do, which is the success state in our case, HTTP URL response. For the URL, which is basically the URL, for the status code, it's going to be 200. HTTP version null, headers fields are headers, and we have to do the non-null value. Next, we're going to store the response data, try, and encoder, encode correct response. Instead of 200, we will return 404. Basically, this product not found. Now for the response data, encode API response of type product DTO, and for the data here should be product DTO and empty. And it has to give us basically URL response and data. At the end, we're going to return response and response data. And we can infer basically the rest of the methods from the previous application Kotlin or Jetpack Compose application. We need to implement the get search suggestions as well as search products. In this particular function, we need to handle form data. So we have to get the search query. And according to the search query, we're going to filter and return the URL response as well as the data. Therefore, I'm going to create a reusable function that's going to basically handle this task for us. Let's come back to the mock URL protocol, public static function. get form data, and it has to give us a dictionary. The key is string, the data type any, and it could be null. And we need here only the request. I'm gonna add here from request of type URL request. Basically, the principle of this function, we're going to extract form data, aka the JSON representation of the form data, from the request body, which is the stream. First of all, get the stream by doing request and HTTP body stream. And because it's nullable, we have to wrap it under, we have to use the guard let statement by doing request and HTTP body stream, which is basically the stream used to deliver the HTTP body. If there is no body, there is no form data. Now we have to open the stream, basically by calling the function open, and we have to make sure that the stream closes after reading by doing defer close. This is going to be executed whenever the stream ends. Next, we need to convert the stream into the data. Let's store the value under data, and we have to do data from the stream. Unfortunately, we don't have the constructor from the stream, so we have to create our own constructor. Add here an extension on data, and we have to add an initializer, a custom initializer, by providing the stream. And the data is a structure. Now for the stream or the parameter, let's call it reading of type input. It's going to initialize a data object by reading all the available bytes from the given input stream. Therefore, it has to be of type input stream. First of all, we're going to initialize an empty data object. Next, we have to define how many bytes to read at a time. Let's call it a buffer 1024. And we have to allocate a buffer of bytes in memory to temporarily store and read the data. And save mutable pointer of type unsigned 8 bytes integer. And we have to allocate the capacity, which is the buffer size that we have defined. Now we have to ensure that the buffer gets deallocated, in other words, freed, when this initializer ends. And again, with the same manner, we're going to do here, to do it using defer, buffer, and deallocate in order to avoid any memory leaks. Next, we're going to read bytes while the stream still has some data to offer by doing while input and has bytes available. First of all, we're going to read up to the buffer size bytes into the buffer. Now we're going to start from the buffer till the buffer size. If the reader greater than 0, we have to append the reader bytes to our data object. Otherwise, we have no data, no more bytes where to read. Basically, this is the end of the stream, or we have an error. I'm going to do break, leave the loop. And we're going to use this initializer by providing the stream. We will try to parse the result into a JSON dictionary, and we have to return that result. If the whole operation fails, it's going to give us a null value. Otherwise, it's going to give us the dictionary that we want. With the data, and we have to convert it basically to the dictionary. This is basically a reusable function that's going to be served or used in multiple places when defining the mock request for products and basically any form data for that matter. Now come back to the product mock request. First of all, going to get the JSON response representing the form data, and we have to get the search query. And with the search query, we're going to make our URL response as well as the data that should be served to the mock response. This could be null, that's why we have done this if let statement. Now let's get the search query. Because right now we have the dictionary, we can access the search query by doing JSON. And for the key, try to make sure that we have the same key from Laravel as string, and we have to open the curly braces. Now, if we have the data, we're going to proceed accordingly. Otherwise, what we should do here, going to throw an exception or an error, and the code here I'm going to do as usual 400. For the URL, it's going to be basically the URL, the status code, we don't have anything to check. Now for the response, it's going to be a little bit different this time. Let's call it response data as usual. We'll try to encode the response, which is from the mock data and suggested products. And for the query, which is the search query, whatever the filter functionality is going to give us. It will be according to this search query. And finally, we will return value response as well as the response data. Now for the last function, which is search products. As usual, we're going to make the request using the put, or I think it's a post method, and we have to get the search query. If we don't have a valid payload, we're going to return the same result, or we're going to throw the same error, which is unsupported payload, and the code here is 400. Now, if we have a valid payload, what we have to do, the response basically is the same response that we have used before. And for the response data, it's going to be try, encoder, and encode from the mock data and search pagination response. And we have to provide here the search query. And finally, we will return the response as well as the response data. As simple as this. And we are done basically with product mock requests. All right, so I prefer, in my opinion, let's implement all the others for wishlist and authentication. And when we are going to be done with all of that, we will use them under the mock URL. Now, in the same manner, I'm going to create here a new file. I'm going to call it authentication mock request. And let's define the first function, which is the login function. It should take in parameter URL, headers, and encoder, and it can throw an exception and has to give us URL response as well as the related data. And because it consists of a post method, we have to get the form data and we have to retrieve the email and password. Otherwise, we will throw an error. I'm going to store here the response and the response data because we have actually two cases. If we have provided the correct credentials, going to return a certain response and a certain data. Otherwise, we will return another response and another data. That's why I'm going to create here initially the response as well as the response data. If we have a valid email and a valid password, I'm going to respect what we have done under Laravel. If we have valid credentials, create the login response, data and user DTO, as well as the token, mock data and token. For the API response, because at the end of the day, we have to return an API response. For the data is login response that we have created. Next, we're going to construct the, or to create the HTTP URL response. The status code is 200, which is very important, and we have to pass the headers. For the response data, we're going to encode the API response. Invalid credentials, the unauthorized response is going to contain only the empty user and empty token. The status code 401, at the end, we have to encode response, which is unauthorized response. Underneath, we need to return the response and response data. And this is basically the login function. Now for the register function, we need to get the name, email, password, and password confirmation. And let's copy this in case if we have unsupported payload. And inside, what we should do here is just going to return the valid response or register response. And for the response data, it's going to be from the mock data register response, and we have to fill the full name, email, password, and password confirmation. And at the end, we're going to return the response as well as the response data. And that's pretty much it. For the other function to check if the user is authenticated or not, we're going to check if we have a valid bearer token and the bearer token or GWT token is correct. We can say that the user is authenticated, otherwise it's not authenticated. This is basically how we're going to mock this response and the related data. I'm going to declare the response as well as the response data. And right now we have to get the token from the header. It's going to be request and value from header fields. So I'm going to delete this S, extra S. It's authorization. If we have a valid bearer token, by doing token from header equal bearer, and let's add here space. Let's access the bearer token or the GWT token, the mock GWT token from mock data. In this case, we're going to return a response, otherwise another response. The response is going to be of status code 200. And for the response data, authenticated user response, there is no need actually to declare this. I'm going to copy this. If we have the correct GWT token, the status code is going to be 200. Otherwise, it is 401. I'm going to create another field, to be honest. It's a Boolean value. And if it is authenticated, or let's call has correct token, and we have to pass as correct token. I think it's much cleaner. The last function, which is logout, with the same manner, instead of using authenticated response or authenticated user response, we will use the logout response. And we are done basically with the authentication mock request. And we have one other mock request to handle, which is basically the wishlist mock request. It's worth mentioning here for the implementation for toggle wishlist mock request, we're going to assume that we will always test with the product sunglasses product response. Now we have to get the product ID and we have to get the token from the header. If we have valid product ID, we're going to proceed. Otherwise, we will throw an error. Now we have the token from the header. I'm going to declare the response as well as response data. And I'm going to copy this one, going to paste it here. If has correct token, if it doesn't have the correct token, the response will be 401. And we have to pass an empty list. And at the bottom, going to return the response as well as the related response data. Now let's focus on this particular section because it needs some implementation. Now the key here is we need to keep track of the wishlist or the mock wishlist. Therefore, I'm going to create under the mock request, or you can create it under mock data, but I think it has to be created under the mock URL protocol, a public enum. I'm going to call it wishlist mock state. That's going to hold for us, which is basically it's a static variable holding the current wishlist initialized from the mock data, user, DTO, and wishlist. For this one, it's not going to serve our purpose because it has to be mutable. This is just for mocking purposes. It's not for production. Now let's come back to the mock request from the mock state, current wishlist. Now we need to get the index by filtering by the product's ID. First index. Now we can do different operations. The index equal item, which means that we have the item already in our wishlist. Therefore, we're going to remove the item from the wishlist. Otherwise, we have to add it to the wishlist. I'm going to define here the wishlist item ID as well as the inserted product. If it's not null, we're going to remove. Otherwise, we have to add. And we have to do remove at index. And we have to assign the wishlist item ID to be served as a response data. We need to add here an item. First of all, I'm going to initialize the item that should be added to the wishlist. And let's convert it. It's going to be the product DTO from the mock data. So this is basically the product that should be added. We're going to take the first occurrence and we're going to access the product detail. This is the product DTO. Now let's create the new item, which is from the mock data and inserted wishlist item for the product's ID, which is basically the product's ID. And for the detail, we are assuming always the sunglasses product response, which is the correct one. Now let's do product DTO, which is the detail. Next, we're going to append this particular item and the wishlist item ID and the inserted product. Now, after doing so, we need to update the shared mock state. We will create the response and we're going to create the response data. We're going to change this to sendable in a bit. And we have to return the response as well as the response data, but it should be placed basically underneath the else statement. This should be sendable. Now for the function get entire wishlist, if has correct token, otherwise. If we are not providing the correct token, set for 01 and empty list. Both cases we have to return the response and the related response data. Now if we have the correct token, we're going to return a status code of 200 and the EPR response, which is the wishlist mock state and the current wishlist. And that's all for our mock URL. Let's use that under the mock URL protocol. Implement the other case. The URL contains the product detail. And we will return get product detail. Now for search product, it will return search product. Now for search suggestions, providing the URL headers and encoder. For search product, with the same manner, we're going to define the needed API endpoints for login, request, register, and logout. With the same for is authenticated. And we have the last one, toggle wishlist. It needs to match a regex expression. I'm gonna create here an extension function on string, provide here the pattern of type string. It has to contain this particular ID or this kind of placeholder. First of all, going to evaluate the regular expression. If it is null, we're going to return false. And finally, we'll return regular expression and first match to detect basically if we have the correct route or not. For the option empty array, basically the range is ns range, self-referring to the string all the way to self and index in self. So we can say it matches the needed route. We will return toggle wishlist URL and headers and encoder. And that's pretty much it for the handler of the mock URL protocol. I would like to add here, just for reusability purposes, a method that's going to make the request. Basically, we're going to create a custom URL session that uses this mock URL protocol. First of all, we have to configure the session. Finally, we have to return the URL session. We have to pass here as an argument the configuration that we have defined before, and we're going to use this basically in our tests. I think that's pretty much it for this mock URL protocol. We have to implement one last mock implementation for the crypto service. Let's call it mock crypto service. Variable is saved false as a default one. When saving, we're going to call here is saved equal true, and we're going to create here another simulation basically for the token storage. Basically, it's going to be in memory. In case we have saved the token, what we have to do here is store token equal the token from the function or the parameter function save token to keychain. Now to load the token from the keychain, basically we're going to return the stored token in memory. For testing purposes, it's worth it and it's rewarding at the end. I think that's pretty much it for today's video. For the next video, we're going to focus on the rest of the API. Basically, we're going to finish implementing the core app module. I hope you liked the video. See you in the next one and happy coding.